I'm Tom Baker.
I'm Jake Williams, and this is Chasing Cars.
And today we're looking at 4 of our favourite front-wheel drive hot hatches. These cars have to do a bunch of things well. They have to be a fantastic blast on the right road, but they also have to be comfortable and usable every day as daily drivers.
The Honda Civic Type R is by far and away the most expensive car in this comparison, but it's also the most powerful, and if it's your kind of thing, it's the most extroverted in terms of styling. But is it really worth $11,000 more than the cheapest car in this test?
And the cheapest car in this test is this brand new Hyundai i30N, a car that a bunch of us have really been looking forward to because it packs lots of power, a proper front-end diff and an amazing exhaust note into a package that's under $40,000. But is it the real deal?
The Peugeot 308 GTI is definitely the left field choice of this comparison. A recent range simplification and a price cut by $5,000 has tried to make the car more appealing to a wider audience. So has it?
And any hot hatch comparison would be nothing without the classic that invented the segment, the Volkswagen Golf GTI. However, in 2018, the GTI is starting to look pretty far down on power compared to the other cars in this test. So, is it still the benchmark, or a Volkswagen resting on their laurels? That's what we've come down here to the New South Wales Southern Highlands to find out. We've put the cars through their paces, but of course any hot hatch has to start with a comfortable and practical interior that you won't get tired of using these vehicles day after day.
So without further ado, let's find out.
But before we dive inside these cars, let's detail what we have here. 3 hot hatches arrive with a very strong lineage behind them. There's Germany's seminal hot hatch, the Volkswagen Golf GTI, in its 7th generation, seen here in base 5-door form with 169 kilowatts of power. From Japan is the Honda Civic Type R, the 5th of its kind, packing 228 kilowatts. The French send the Peugeot 308 GTI 270 into the fray with 200 kilowatts even. And then there is the newcomer, Korea's first ever serious performance car and hot hatch, the Hyundai i30N, with 202 kilowatts, a host of mechanical upgrades over its donor car, the superb engineering know-how of Albert Biermann, formerly of BMW M, and a mean look and exhaust note to boot. But can the i30N, with no heritage to speak of, unseat cars that have been refining this recipe for years? Well, we brought these 4 hot hatches together, we pored over them with a fine-tooth comb inside and out. We drove them for 1,000 kilometers each, in town and in country, and we found out. We'll take these cars out onto the road in a minute, but first let's see what you get inside each, which is where you'll be spending plenty of time using these cars for their purposes as daily drivers. So let's jump in first to the Hyundai i30N.
Inside, the Hyundai i30N is heavily based on the standard PD i30's cabin, and that's no bad thing. We do like the way the standard i30 looks and feels inside. That said, there's not a huge amount of visual differentiation of the N, mostly because effectively all the money went on the oily bits underneath the skin, which is exactly where it should be spent. but you are left with a fairly dark cabin inside the i30, and that means lots of black plastics that cover the dashboard here, some of which are actually pretty hard. And compared to the plush cabins of the Peugeot and the Volkswagen, a step up in material quality would have helped the Hyundai i30N. That said, it does present really nicely. You get a floating 8-inch touchscreen with navigation, and a bunch of customized N features here where you can have a look at your power and torque graphs, the turbo pressure, lap timer, G-forces, etc. That's plenty of fun to play around with. And you look forward at a really attractive steering wheel with perforated black leather, performance blue stitching, and drive mode and N drive mode buttons also in performance blue. Now, N Division is headed up by the former head of BMW M, and you can really tell that in the seats that have been installed in the i30N, and that's simply because they are quite a lot like a BMW seat, right down to the manual leg extender, which means that drivers of all shapes and sizes can get comfortable. This particular i30N is the luxury pack, which means you get leather and Alcantara seats that are particularly adjustable, and I think they're quite a bit better than the standard cloth seat. You get wireless phone charging, a feature that you can't get in other cars here. And in general, it's a fairly practical vehicle. So there's big cup holders between the seats, a large tray ahead of this really attractive shifter, and quite a deep central bin that complements the medium-sized but unlined door bins.
The back of the i30N is a bit smaller than the standard car because of those beefy sports seats, but 6-footers have more than adequate headroom, although legroom is pretty restricted. There's a fold-down centre armrest which gives you a pair of cup holders, but there are no air vents in the back of the Hyundai. In terms of the boot, behind that tailgate there's 381 litres of space, down from 395 in the standard car because of that removable strut brace you see there.
One of the Golf GTI's biggest advantages in this comparison is that it starts with the underlying cabin of the normal Golf, which is already a really good place to spend time. And then Volkswagen have put enough into this interior to differentiate the GTI from the cars that sit below it. And of course, that starts with the heritage tartan seats that you get in the Golf GTI. These look fantastic. You can upgrade to leather seats as part of a luxury package that also gives you stuff like a sunroof, but personally, I wouldn't bother. The cloth seats are already really comfortable and supportive. They've got manual lumbar for your back. They've got a good range of adjustment. We really like them. Otherwise, there's red stitching around the place, including here on the steering wheel and in the shift boot as well, to remind you that you've got a GTI. It all presents really nicely. The Golf Mark 7's interior is pretty well set out and functional, so you have a cascading center console here, a new 8-inch touchscreen for the Mark 7.5 GTI. That works well. It's got Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And you look forward at attractive analog gauges, which can also be upgraded to Volkswagen's active info display, the digital cluster to put the map in front of you. And material quality is similarly impressive, so there's lots of soft touch materials up here on the dash and on the doors. The leather on the steering wheel and the shifter feels really nice. And that leads me on to the practicality of the Golf, which is, as you'd expect, totally fine. There's a small central bin here, 2 cup holders between the seats, a tray ahead of the shifter where you'll find this car's 1 USB port, although actually getting a cable into that USB is a little bit tough. And there's flockline door bins. All in all, the GTI is about Golf ownership, and Golf ownership is about practicality, and that's what you get in this car.
Echoing the general practicality of the Volkswagen Golf, the GTI has a roomy back seat. 6-footers will find that they've got enough legroom, and headroom is also well taken care of, especially without the sunroof. There is a fold-down armrest with adjustable cup holders, and you get air vents in the back of the Golf GTI, which is nice. In terms of boot space, behind the tailgate, opening with the badge, you find the standard Golf's boot with 380 litres of space. It's nice and flat and square in shape.
The cabin of the Honda Civic Type R is classic hot hatch, and it's also classic Type R. There's lots of red everywhere, as you can tell. The steering wheel has lovely nice red bits. The red Honda badge is a Type R clue, as well as the lovely red on the seats and the red stitching around the cabin as well. The seats themselves are extremely comfortable despite appearances, and they really contribute to this car's all-day practicality. They're reasonably adjustable, so you get height adjustment, but you don't get lumbar adjustment or anything like that. These are just kind of set and fixed seats. Center point of the Civic's cabin in all Civics, as well as this Type R, is this 7-inch infotainment system right here. You get Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and you get digital radio as well. But unlike the Golf GTI, the Peugeot and the i30N, you don't get inbuilt satellite navigation, which is a little bit mean considering how much this car costs. One thing that is noticeable is that the quality is pretty much identical to the regular Civic models. Much like the quality of the cabin, the Civic Type R's practicality is pretty much identical as well. You get a lovely huge centre bin here with an adjustable armrest. You get a nice little tray below the dashboard so you can store your phone out of sight and out of mind while you're driving. And you get some reasonable door bins as well, though they're not flock line unlike the Golf.
Thanks to its additional length over other cars here, the Civic offers the most legroom, though its headroom is fairly limited. The sport seats also intrude a little bit more than they would in a regular Civic, and you'll find no rear air vents. One thing to note is that the Civic is only a 4-seater. Open the enormous tailgate of the Civic Type R and you get a nice wide open space with 414 litres on offer.
The era of the really high quality Peugeot cabin started with 308 in 2014, and 4 years on it still feels as fresh and as premium as the day that it was released. There's lots of little GTI touches, such as the GTI badge on the steering wheel. There's lots of red everywhere in the cabin. It really makes an effort to look like a performance car. You sit in these really lovely, comfortable sport seats. They've got Alcantara, suede and half leather upholstery. They're very comfortable and they really add to this car's kind of dual personality. They've got a massaging function, which is something that the other cars don't have. Peugeot's iCockpit system is something that some people don't like, but we at Chasing Cars really like because you get your speed quite close to your eyes where they are on the road. It means that you don't have to take your eyes off the road, you don't have to look around the cabin, your speed is right in front of you and it's quite convenient to look at. Now, central to the 308's cabin is this 7-inch touchscreen infotainment system. It's got inbuilt satellite navigation as well as Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, but it doesn't feature digital radio, unlike the Civic and the i30. Now, if there's anything that I could complain about with the cabin of the Peugeot is that ergonomically and practically, it's not as good as the other cars in this comparison. Now, ergonomically, there are no air conditioning buttons, so when you want to change the temperature, for example, you have to hit a button on the stereo, it goes into the temperature zone, and then you change it. Also, practically, it's not particularly impressive. You get some big door bins, but that's about it. There's a little dinky tray here in front of the car's sole 12-volt socket and sole USB input. There's a little tray in here with a bit of a center storage bit. It's also got the car's single cup holder in true French tradition, and there's a bit of a central cubby under the armrest, but it's not really that big. So overall, the cabin of the 308 GTI is a really nice place to be, but it's not the most practical car here.
The Peugeot 308 is a fairly small car, so rear seat space is fairly limited. The headroom, especially with this panoramic sunroof, is not generous, and rear space in terms of legroom is a little bit limited as well. There is a rear centre armrest with 2 cup holders. There are no rear air vents, though there is a little tray on the centre console. What you lose in rear seat space, however, you gain in boot space. The Peugeot has the biggest boot here at 470 litres. It's also quite a nice deep, open and square space. With an assessment of the interiors out of the way, it was time to take these hot hatches out onto the road to really see which of these cars offers the best all-round capability for the money. And in deference to its status as the founding member of this club, we started in the Volkswagen Golf GTI.
So we're starting in the Golf GTI, which is the real benchmark hot hatch to a lot of people and the car that invented this segment. So I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. So this is definitely the all-rounder of the group, all things considered. And the GTI has the reputation of being the all-round hot hatch as well.
It's come a long way, the Volkswagen Golf GTI. It's in its 7th generation, and the car that we're driving is fundamentally a Mark 7 Golf GTI, but this is the updated 7.5, as they're calling it, which came in at the end of last year with a little bit more power, 169 kilowatts and 350 Newton meters from a 2-litre turbo 4, some revised lines outside, and a little bit more in-car technology.
Now, like the pre-update of the Golf GTI in Mark 7 form, you can get 2 transmissions. You can get a 6-speed manual or this 6-speed dual clutch automatic. This particular gearbox is a good example of the dual clutch breed because it doesn't show much hesitancy when starting off, and the longer gear ratios mean that it likes to be a bit more precise with its gear changes.
And that's an interesting one because actually the GTI has stuck with Volkswagen's old wet clutch DSG. VW have developed a new wet clutch 7-speed, and that's gone into cars like the Golf R, but we actually don't like that as much as this old version with 6 ratios. It really just doesn't have that much hesitancy around town.
It's a very good gearbox to use around town, and that's predominantly where a lot of GTI buyers drive as well. This is definitely the best car to take on your daily drive to work and so on.
The particular engine that's in the Golf GTI 7.5 is still Volkswagen's EA888 2-litre Turbo 4, and this is the engine that goes into a lot of Volkswagen Group performance cars. Not that that's a problem, because the engine has really been refined and improved over time, and it remains one of our favourite 4-cylinder engines. It makes a decent sound, it's pretty quiet. You can pump in fake engine noise by playing with the drive modes in this car, but it actually sounds best when just left to its own devices. It's not a loud car, but it has a really nice exhaust note if you listen carefully for it.
Definitely, this engine is definitely a real dual personality engine. When you're just driving around town, it's strong, it's quite linear, and it is quite quiet as well. But when you're on it, when you're going a lot faster, it sounds really good, and it's quite punchy in the mid-range too.
And the drive modes that you can pick in the Golf GTI are actually delineated pretty well from one another. So comfort mode is nice and plush, and the GTI comes with adaptive dampers as standard. In both comfort and normal, this is a really comfy car to drive just day to day, and it does a pretty good impression of just an absolutely normal Golf, which a lot of people will love. But then when you put it into sport mode, it does firm up a bit. That said, the Golf GTI does have more body roll than any other car in this comparison.
Not that body roll is a problem, this car definitely relies more on its chassis than its tyres, unlike some other cars in this comparison, and there's definitely a few different layers to the way the GTI drives.
Whereas other cars here, particularly the Honda Civic Type R, but also in many ways the Hyundai i30N, are all about a good front end, the Golf GTI relies much more on its back end than you'd expect a hot hatch to, and you can induce lift-off oversteer incredibly easily in the Volkswagen Golf GTI. On the surface, the GTI looks like a softer edge than other cars in this comparison, but actually you find that when you drive it towards 10 tenths, the Volkswagen stands up to every other car here. It's pretty quick, especially when equipped with the DSG. It'll do about 6.5 seconds to 100, but then it'll really work it in the corners with a body that moves around underneath you a lot more than you'd expect. It's a lot of fun. My favourite thing about this car is this is really a car that can do everything. It can be incredibly fun to drive when you find a good road and you're able to get on it, but then you can just relax into it around town, and it also looks really sophisticated and understated, so I wouldn't be embarrassed picking up my parents or a client for a meeting in a Golf GTI.
No, I completely agree. It's such a good all-rounder, as it always has been, but it's also very classy, and the cabin is a very nice place to spend time.
So the Hyundai i30N, probably the car that we've been looking forward to driving the most in this comparison test, and it's not often that an incoming hot hatch carries as much hype as the i30N has. It's been a long time coming, it's finally here, and we've got lots of questions about this car, namely whether or not it can beat the Volkswagen Golf GTI at its own game in terms of being a hot hatch that you really can use every day, but gives you more thrills than the Golf GTI for less money, because of course this car comes in under 40 grand.
Which is an amazing achievement if you think about it. Now, under the bonnet of the i30N is a 2-litre petrol engine like in the Golf. It's turbocharged and it gives that more power and slightly more torque than the Golf. So you get 202 kilowatts of power and you get 353 newton meters of torque.
And in fact, that torque figure blows right out to 378 newton meters on overboost. So for about 18 seconds, the i30N can give you 25 newton meters more torque. When you're at full throttle, it just needs a few seconds to refresh in between uses, and that's what makes the i30N really feel like quite a quick car when you get it right into its torque band. Now, of course, about 6 months ago when we first drove this car, we didn't really know which of the tunes Hyundai was going to bring to Australia, because like a lot of cars these days, the i30N globally is available in 2 specifications. There is a 184 kilowatt version that's available overseas that doesn't have a proper differential on the front end, but in the end Hyundai Australia was able to secure such a sharp price point for the Halo version, which overseas is called the Performance Pack, and that carries the 202 kilowatt tune plus a proper electronically controlled mechanically locking front differential. And the Golf GTI is the only car on this test to not grab a proper front diff, but it's actually in the i30N that you feel it working to the strongest extent. And this car really is good at putting the power down over long sweeping country bends where a normal front wheel drive car, like the Volkswagen Golf GTI, finds itself scrabbling for grip.
Now, unlike the Golf GTI, you can only get one transmission in the i30N for the moment. It's a 6-speed manual and it can be a little bit notchy, but otherwise it's a very sweet gearbox to use. Hyundai say that an 8-speed dual-clutch automatic is coming in 2019, but until then, it's manual or nothing.
Well, I really like the manual in the i30N. To me, it feels like a bit of a combination of some of the best hot hatch manuals that are out there. In fact, the shifter itself looks a bit like the one that you get in a Golf GTI with the manual gearbox, although without the golf ball indents within the shifter itself. There's a nice short throw, and in fact, Hyundai have managed to engineer probably the best automatic rev match downshift feature that I've used in any car. It's really consistent. You can turn it on and off via a button on the steering wheel. And basically, it just makes you feel like a pro driver with perfectly smooth downshifts every time. What do you think about that feature?
I really like it myself, and it's better than in the Honda as well. The Honda offers you that, but if you don't like it, you can just press rev on the steering wheel and it turns off, whereas in the Honda you have to dive through different menus to turn it off.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I also think it makes the i30N a lot easier to drive in traffic. And I think that does kind of bring down the importance of having an automatic a little bit. I think the i30N will be hurt by not having an auto in the Australian market, but at least this is a nice, easy manual. I reckon I could put my mum into this car and she'd be able to drive it without too much of a problem. The i30N does have adaptive dampers as standard. There's 3 modes, like in the Golf GTI, but we found that it's really only in this car's normal mode that it's livable on Australian roads. In normal, it's good. But in Sport and Sport Plus, it tends to get thrown around a little bit by big bumps on country roads. That said, the i30N's pretty heavy, so it does feel nice and planted. It actually comes pretty close to about 1.5 tons, and you can feel it, can't you?
Definitely, and especially going from Peugeot into the i30, it's a massive difference. And even in the steering itself, the steering can be quite heavy in this car, no matter what mode you're in. So you go from the dainty, light Peugeot to the heavy i30, and you really can feel it.
And different people will put a differing amount of priority on that factor. But for me, one thing I love about front-wheel drive hot hatches is that you should be able to move the whole car around underneath you once you start driving towards 10/10ths. And in fact, on the road, that's quite difficult in the Hyundai simply because it's so heavy, the back end just does not want to step out. It's also a product of the really sticky tires that Hyundai fit to this car as standard. So the i30N has customized Pirelli P0s stamped with HN for Hyundai N. And in fact, you can accessorize even stickier semi-slicks in the form of Pirelli's Trofeo R tyre. And on that tyre, it's just unbelievably grippy. One issue of the i30N is it's a little bit noisy, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Road noise is a trait that all i30s share, unfortunately. And it's definitely not as loud as the Honda, but still, you definitely notice it, and it's a lot louder than the Golf, for example.
But one noise we really do like about the i30N is the exhaust note. Hyundai obviously listened to hot hatch buyers when they were developing this car because it's easily the best sounding vehicle of this whole group. You can change how loud it is, but for us, we'd keep it in the loudest possible Sport Plus exhaust mode all the time.
And like the Mercedes-AMG A45, you get lots of lovely little crackles and pops, and it really adds a bit of theatre to the i30N that's missing from the Civic Type R or the Golf GTI.
And the best part about it is that the noise is actually real, and you can hear it really just as loudly inside the car and outside. And painted in performance blue, the i30N really does attract its fair share of attention. And I think that's probably my favourite thing about this car, is that it's a little bit more extroverted and a little bit more interesting to look at and listen to than the Volkswagen Golf GTI. I feel like Hyundai really studied what hot hatches are all about when making this car, and as a first effort, the i30N is pretty tremendous. Does it have the ultimate dynamic noose of the Golf GTI or the various levels of ability that you can explore over time? I'm not quite sure.
No, I completely agree. The best thing about the i30 is that it's a great first try. I mean, they've got almost everything correct, and it's the first proper hot hatch that they've ever made. And as we said with the exhaust, there's a bit of theatre, there's a bit of drama. It looks really good from the outside, and overall, I think it's a really good car. In a few key areas, the Peugeot is different to the cars we're comparing it to. The first of which is that it's a lot lighter than even the Golf. It weighs just 1,180 kilograms. Instead of a 2-litre engine like the other cars deploy, this only has a 1.6-litre engine, but it still has competitive outputs at 200 kilowatts and 330 newton meters. But the third part, and perhaps the most substantial, is that it only has a torsion beam rear suspension setup instead of an independent one.
What all this tends to mean is that the 308 feels pretty alive on you when you find a good road. It's so light, it is susceptible to getting chucked around quite a lot by the mid-corner bumps that Australian roads tend to throw up really regularly. This can be a little disconcerting if you're not expecting the 308's rear end to get chucked away from the front of the car, for example. But that said, the lightness means that you can exploit the 308's really tremendous chassis a lot easier than you can, for example, in the very heavy i30.
Yes, it's this lightness that really gives the character of the 308 a bit of a boost compared with, say, the Golf or even the i30. It means it's quite a fun car to chuck around on country roads, and the steering, although it's not the last word in feedback, it's still quite quick and it allows you to drive quickly with confidence.
Plus, I really like the Peugeot small steering wheel. The brand has deployed this steering wheel throughout their contemporary range, and opinion is split on whether it's a good or a bad thing, but I like it because it's so small. You actually need less effort to achieve more of a turn, and I think that you can still see really clearly over it. It doesn't obscure the speedometer as some people say it does.
No, I completely agree. It's a really good setup, and it means that your speed is quite close to your eyesight on the road. You don't have to look around the cabin for other things like the speedometer or your revs. And one thing we do like about this car is its engine. So it's a 1.6 litre turbo petrol, and it's used in other Peugeot models. In Australian tune, it's got 200 kilowatts of power and 330 newton meters of torque. And Australia only gets the higher power 270 version now. We used to get the 250, which exists in other markets, but Peugeot Australia decided to stop selling it.
The 308 GTI isn't a big seller in Australia, so it's a good thing that they've rationalised the range to just the GTI 270 model, which of course has 270 PS. That's definitely competitive with this class here, and in fact, the Peugeot 308 GTI has the best power to weight ratio of this entire group. That said, it only runs about a 6-second 0 to 100 time. It feels pretty boosty, and it does some of its best work when you're really wringing this car's neck, which is definitely fun to do. It has a decent manual gearbox, but this is another area of the 308's dynamics that does tend to attract two camps of opinion. For me, I'm not a huge fan of the Peugeot clutch. I think it has this really long travel, but the friction point is right at the top. That said, other testers that drove the car with us this week thought that the clutch was really great in the 308.
Yeah, I did definitely, and it's a lot better than what you get in the Hyundai i30.
Well, I think that's where we differ on that point, but I think something we'll agree on is that the throw in the 308's manual is just way too long. Compared to cars like the Type R or the i30, which have quite a nice short throw, the 308 makes you really lift your whole arm right back to get from third to fourth, for example.
Yeah, it can make around town driving a little bit annoying, but still, it's a good gearbox to use. Now, Tom, what's one of your favourite things about this car?
I think my favourite thing about the 308 GTI is that it actually does what the Volkswagen Golf GTI does really well, which is that this is a good all-round car. It's refined enough to drive every day. It's nice and quiet. It also looks sophisticated and understated, but then it is dynamically capable on a good road. So if you like the Golf GTI and what it stands for, but you want a more left field and alternative choice, I think I'd go for a Peugeot 308 GTI 270.
Yep, definitely agree. This car is a really good all-rounder, and it doesn't even have adaptive dampers like you get in the Golf. It just has one setting, and the setting is really good no matter what the situation you're in. Right, so the Honda Civic Type R, which as I said at the beginning is the most expensive, it's the most powerful, and it's the most extroverted car in this comparison.
So it needs to be pretty good in order to justify its price. So the Honda is about $5,000 more than the Volkswagen if you get it with a DSG, like the car we've got on test, or the Peugeot, which is manual only. But interestingly, the Honda is over $10,000 more expensive than the Hyundai,
which is a big jump if you're looking for a hot hatch.
It does have a lot more engine than the other cars on test, so it is still a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder, but it makes 228 kilowatts of power and 400 newton meters of torque. So that's up on the Golf GTI by over 50 kilowatts.
Yeah, and what really, we're comparing a car that competes with the Golf R on at least power levels, but it is cheaper than the Golf R for sure. One thing I like about this Honda is that it's not like a Honda Evolve. It doesn't have VTEC in its oldest form, so the power is right through the rev range. You don't have to rev it right to the top to get anything out of it.
That said, they have tried to simulate VTEC in where the turbo does its best work. Although you do have enough torque on tap around town, as you say, it does come on song around 3,500 RPM, and it's from there that you can easily feel that the Honda is the fastest car in this test.
Yep, by far. nothing seems to really faze the Honda in its pursuit of speed, thanks to its very good unlimited slip differential at the front and adaptive suspension like the Golf. It really is unfazed by all types of Australian roads.
That was a real surprise because the Civic Type R comes clad in some enormous wheels. So it's got 20-inch wheels and really licorice thin Continental Conti Sport 6 tyres. So looking at this car from the outside, you'd think it'd be a real bone shaker. But to the contrary, I actually think it's one of the most comfortable cars on this test.
Definitely. The adaptive suspension, even in sport mode as opposed to comfort mode, is more than tolerable around town. And it does get a little bit firmer in R+ mode, but it's still entirely manageable every day.
And you bring up the front end differential, and that's why we've got the Civic Type R in this comparison. Although on price it competes with cars like the Volkswagen Golf R rather than the GTI, at the end of the day this is a front wheel drive hot hatch sort of king, and so we wanted to see whether or not it justifies that extra price against the cheaper cars that we've got here.
One thing I love about the Civic compared with the cars here is its gear shift. So Honda are known for making legendary manual gearboxes, and this is no different. Unlike the Peugeot, which when you row it, it seems like you start in New South Wales and end in Victoria, it's just so long. The Civic's gear shift is precise, it's short, and the clutch itself is very good to use as well. It's very easy, and you get to notice the bite point a lot easier than some of the other cars here.
It is a really lovely manual, and I love that short shift and the metallic head on the shifter. It feels great in the hand. Although one thing I did notice is that the automated rev matching in this car doesn't seem to work as consistently as it does in the Hyundai i30N. Not everyone will want automated rev matching. The Honda does have it, but you have to really dig through the menus in order to turn it off.
Now, unlike the suspension, which does change when you switch drive modes, the steering doesn't change all that much. Even in comfort mode, it is quite heavy, and that's possibly thanks to the large 20-inch wheels, but around town, that is something that could be a little bit annoying, a little bit painful to use.
It's a bit frustrating because the front end on this Honda is easily the best here on test. It's simply so sharp at the front end, but one thing I found is that that's kind of the only thing the Honda really does. It relies a lot on that front. It absolutely darts into corners with way more tenacity than any other car here, but other than that, I didn't find I was able to move the Civic's body around too much on the road.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's like the Golf R. It's quite one-dimensional in its handling. You kind of stick it in, it grips and you go, but there's no real rear end adjustability. It's kind of point and shoot.
I think a lot of people will like that, but something a lot of people won't like is how noisy the Honda tends to get. It's easily the loudest car in terms of the road noise that enters the cabin, including when you're just cruising.
So my particular favorite thing about the Honda is the fact that you can just point it, it shoots, and it goes really quickly no matter what the surface. But I can imagine that being annoying to some people that want something a little bit more fun to drive.
I really like the boosty engine of this Honda. I think it's a little bit more characterful in terms of what's under the bonnet. But in terms of whether I think it's worth it over the Hyundai, I'd really have to question that. I think once you stray into the 50 grand plus territory, you encounter some really strong all-wheel drive hot hatch competition, including the Golf R. So I'd carefully be test driving the cars in this test before throwing the maximum amount of cash on the Honda.
Definitely.
So we've assessed these cars for their interiors, their practicality, and the way they drive on a mix of Australian roads in town and country. 1,000 kilometres later, we've had plenty to consider in deciding a winner from a quartet of fun, well-rounded, 5-door hot hatches that span an $11,000 price range from the Hyundai to the Honda.
No car loses this comparison. Each of these hatches brings something unique to the table, but before we talk about the cars that we think make up the top two, let's talk about the Honda Civic Type R and the Peugeot 308 GTI. The Honda Civic Type R is a superb hot hatch, and in many ways it is worthy of its premium status here, sitting above the $50,000 watermark. Its front end is supercar sharp, and in concert with hugely grippy tyres, the Civic corners like it's on rails. Plus, it has the nicest manual shift here by far. We actually had the Civic here because it is front-wheel drive, but in actual fact, it is best compared with the Golf R and the Focus RS, which is where you'll see it again. Meanwhile, the Peugeot 308 GTI is completely different to the Honda. It is staggeringly lightweight, more than 150 kilograms lighter than the Golf GTI and 300 kilograms lighter than the Hyundai. And you feel every bit of that. The Peugeot is alive with a body that moves freely around the road when pushed. But it does mean that the Peugeot is skittish on the rough country roads that are the norm in Australia, and at $46,000 it looks expensive here.
So for us, the real battle decided here was between the archetypal hot hatch, the Volkswagen Golf GTI, and the emerging newcomer, Hyundai's first generation i30N, a vehicle that clearly has the Golf squarely in its sights. The reason this pair formed the top two was that they are the truest cars here to what we think the hot hatch recipe is all about. These cars have to be attainably priced, and arguably anything over 45 grand is pushing it. A great hot hatch will be usable every day, whether the task is grabbing milk at the shops, getting to work, or picking up your in-laws in something that looks respectable enough. Then you need to be able to get away from it all on the weekend and really indulge. These hot hatches need to be able to deliver layers and levels of fun to encourage their drivers to explore and deepen their abilities. So, what does that best? The Hyundai i30N has arrived on the scene at the perfect time. This vehicle is the opposite of a rush job. Instead, Hyundai have nailed the process of arriving here. Several years ago, they decided they wanted to build a hot hatch to stand toe-to-toe with the Golf GTI, and they've put the money, the time, and most critically, a serious engineering effort into making that a reality. If there's a crack team with more potential than Hyundai's end performance right now, I honestly cannot name it. Starting with the impressive donor PD i30, these guys have transformed Hyundai's hatchback into an enviable performance car. It has a strong engine with a cracking engine note, literally. You are seen and you are definitely heard in the i30N. This is a car that indulges the senses every time you get behind the wheel. You feel special. It pleases the heart. And it pleases the head because it's the cheapest car here. But some things were inescapable for Albert Biermann and his team, namely the mass of the PD i30. Although it has a tidy front end and stacks of grip thanks to the Pirelli rubber, you cannot make the i30N dance at safe road speeds. On a track, you can make the back end step out in lift-off oversteer, which is surely one of the most flattering responses a front-drive hot hatch can give to its driver. But on Australian roads, which are tight and technical and forbid very high speeds, the layers of dynamic exploration possible in the Hyundai are inherently limited by the laws of physics. On the other hand, the Volkswagen Golf GTI is too subtle. Yes, a conservative design that flies under the radar has always been part of what makes the Golf GTI unique. It's a Q car. Police don't look at you. Your mum can't tell that it's not a Golf comfort line. Only train spotters will pick out the red accents here and there. And the EA888 engine, one of the true greats of Turbo 4s, is just too introverted. There's a great engine note to be liberated here. You can hear it if you listen carefully. But the time has come for Volkswagen to allow the GTI to be more loud straight out of the box. Louder to the ears and to the eyes, with more aggressive lines to differentiate it from the rest of the Golf range. But the nature of busy day-to-day lives means that a great hot hatch will have a true dual personality, and this is where the Golf GTI reveals itself to be a master of the genre. And it should be, after 7.5 generations, to refine the recipe. At all times, the Volkswagen, on sensible 18-inch wheels and adaptive dampers, cossets its driver and passengers with a beautiful plush ride quality. It handles slow urban bumps and huge mid-corner hits out in the country with unsurpassed ease. This is a comfortable car. It could be a bit cheaper than its 43 grand price point in the manual, but it is. You can get a 3-door version for 37.5. But where the Golf GTI remains fundamentally different to the Hyundai is in its sheer dynamic adjustability. Find the right road and step on it, and the Volkswagen chucks away any notion that it's a bread and butter Golf, transforming into a proper animal, gnashing its teeth, revving the bejesus out of its 169 kilowatt 2-litre with astonishing enthusiasm. It gets up and runs, feeling fast and seriously light. The beautifully weighted, creamy steering connects you to a front end that readily slips on its Bridgestone Potenza tyres. No, this car doesn't have an LSD, but it barely matters. Smash the brake pedal and tip the GTI into a corner and it will swing its back end around readily and happily and safely and consistently. Oversteering the whole car with old school attitude, the Golf GTI makes the ordinary driver feel sporty and the sporty driver feel like a pro, as you learn this car's subtle levels and get deeper into a connection with the ultimate all-rounder front drive hot hatch. So yes, we think the Volkswagen Golf GTI needs more attitude. But the old formula of lightness before sheer grunt continues to serve the segment classic well. The Hyundai is way more extroverted while being almost as comfortable, but without the Honda's super front end, or the Volkswagen or Peugeot's back end adjustability, it gets close, but it doesn't quite pip the VW at the post. At least not yet. And that's the point. The i30N was a mere first try. N performance is only just getting started, and we can't wait to see what they do next. For now though, our hot hatch buying dollars belong to the Volkswagen Golf GTI.